This podcast is brought to you by PLI, the Practicing Law Institute, committed to providing essential legal resources to the law school community. For more information, visit pli.edu/law school.
Hello, everyone. I'm Anastasia Boyko, and I am the host of PLI's How to Navigate Law School podcast. How to Navigate Law School is your podcast guide to unlocking the hidden knowledge and practical skills needed to succeed in law school. We connect students with valuable insights from experienced professionals, decompress law school's unwritten rules, and create a supportive community empowering students to confidently create their future. Hello and welcome to PLI's How to Navigate Law School. I am your host, Anastasia Boyko, and today I am joined by Aliza Shatzman, who is the president and founder of the Legal Accountability Project. And today we're going to talk about clerkships. Welcome, Aliza.
Thank you. Thanks for having me on the podcast.
Let's start off. Tell me about your journey since law school and founding LAP.
Yeah. So I graduated from WashU Law in 2019, wanted to be a homicide prosecutor in the DC U.S. Attorney's Office. So like many recent law graduates, I decided to clerk in DC Superior Court, which for anybody who wants to Google me was a very negative experience. I was harassed, fired during the pandemic, and then retaliated against by the judge I clerked for. When I tried to hold him accountable, I discovered that I could not sue him because law clerks like me and 30,000 people who work for the federal courts are exempt from Title VII of the Civil Rights Act and all federal anti-discrimination laws. So I became involved in some legislative advocacy to correct this injustice for folks like me, provided congressional testimony in 2022 in support of legislation that would close that legal loophole for those who work for the courts, and then launched a Legal Accountability Project 3.5 years ago to correct injustices I experienced as a law student and a law clerk, including a lack of transparency, diversity and equity and accountability in clerkships and the judiciary.
Yeah, it's incredible that you took that experience and formed it into a resource for law students. And you regularly speak to law schools around the country on these topics as students figure out how to choose a clerkship. And so what I'd love to do today is take a step back and contextualize clerkships. I went to Yale, which has a large number of students who want to pursue clerkships. So I'd love to talk about why would someone pursue a clerkship? What are the motivations for many students who look at clerkships and how to frame that decision?
Sure. So there are a whole variety of reasons why somebody might clerk. You get an important credential. When we think about various legal luminaries, the first line in their bio is who they clerked for. So it really is an important credential throughout your career. I clerked because it was a necessary checkbox to work for the federal government. Back when those jobs existed for recent grads, the job descriptions used to require 1 year of work experience, which is really a euphemism for a clerkship. So many people do it for the credential. You get, honestly, great writing and research experience. If you want to be a trial attorney, prosecutor, like I did, or public defender, you learn the best and worst of advocacy from those who appear before the court, the lawyers, and then you talk to the judge after about what they thought was effective and not. So those are the good, legitimate reasons why somebody would clerk.
Yeah. So I did not clerk. I had done an internship at the U.S. Supreme Court thinking I wanted to clerk in law school, and this was before law school. And so I got to see what the clerks did day in and day out. It seemed like a lot of reading and research and seemed fairly monastic. Can you get a little bit deeper into the day-to-day of clerking? And I know there will be differences, and we can dive a little bit more into the kinds of jurisdictions where you could clerk. But just to have law students have an understanding of what the ideal work could look like day-to-day.
So folks will clerk in either state or federal court, state courts, trial, appellate, or state Supreme Court. In the federal system, district, appellate, or fancy Supreme Court clerkship for 36 people per year. There are also the DC courts, for example, where I clerked, are Article I courts, so courts created by Congress, others like Court of Federal Claims, Veterans Courts, so some specialty courts. District court clerkships are faster paced. You see a lot more lawyering. You're in court a lot more. Circuit or appellate clerkships, it's a lot more monastic, writing and research in your little office. The day-to-day varies, but it is research and writing. It is helping the judge prepare for hearings or oral arguments. It is perhaps briefing the judge or creating a brief or a memo before you go into court, going to court with the judge and helping them on the bench. And then after, helping them with their legal reasoning as they are writing orders and opinions. So you can have, a lot of impact as a very recent law graduate on the law at a very young age. And so it can be a very formative experience.
Yeah. And as you mentioned, there are certain clerkships that carry a little bit more prestige with them, and there are pluses and minuses to that. But how would you advise law students as they're considering looking at some of the clerkships that aren't as well known, right, or may not be as talked about as like the benefits of maybe doing a court that they would have a different experience in than some of the more prestigious appellate and Supreme Court clerkships?
It's important to think about where you want to practice law, like what state and jurisdiction and what kind of law you want to practice. Maybe you're doing bankruptcy law, so you want to be in a bankruptcy court. Maybe you're from Pennsylvania like me, so being at the Pennsylvania Supreme Court is more important than being at like some fancy federal district court. The most important thing that I tell any law student or anybody I talk to is that the most important thing about your experience, whether it's going to be a good one, is what is the judge like as a manager, as a human, and that should supersede any other consideration, no matter how fancy your clerkship is. If it's a abusive, bullying, retaliatory, career-ending experience like mine, it is not worth it at all. And so I would encourage students to think about where you want to live, what kind of law you want to practice, and what benefits you. You want to be a trial attorney, it probably benefits you to be in either a state or federal trial court. If you want to be in some legal community where your law school is not based or does not send a lot of lawyers, it probably benefits you to clerk there. Any experience can be like a beneficial one, and I think it is really about the work environment more so than anything else. And I say that as somebody who advises thousands of students and recent grads, who collects thousands of positive and very negative stories, experiences about judicial clerkships. You can make your way from any clerkship. You probably will have a much harder time making your way from an abusive one.
Yeah, no, that's so important. I mean, I remember our law students at Yale had gotten a lot of advice, right? Because it is a school that tends to position students to clerk. And one of the most resonant pieces of advice was around like voting with your feet. A lot of the time you're choosing among clerkships. And if you're in a position to get a variety of clerkships, you get to choose what kind of experience you want to have. And you should weigh a substantive experience versus maybe a more prestigious clerkship, and doing research is a key component of that. But I think our judgment can get a little clouded when we have a lot of options in front of us. And so trying to get underneath qualitatively what kind of experience you want to have is really important. I would also love to talk about, a little bit more about practice areas and the relevance of practice areas. I think it can be challenging to decide what you want to do in law school practice area wise, and like trying to make that assumption right after graduation and what you're going to do is challenging. I've heard many law students who do a clerkship and may never practice at all after that point have a really valuable experience. And so how do you guide students who aren't necessarily sure exactly where they want to practice and choosing the types of clerkships if that's the path they want to take after graduation? How would you advise choosing a specific clerkship if maybe you're not sure exactly what kind of law that you want to practice, but you're interested in the clerking experience?
Yeah, I mean, I think the same considerations apply. Any experience can be valuable even if you don't end up practicing. I know many people who don't end up practicing or certainly don't end up litigating who've clerked, and it's still very valuable. I would say, again, like circling back to, it is about the quality of the work environment and the judge as a manager and a human more so than literally anything else. I wanted to go back to something you said earlier about the advice that law students are getting, because whether you go to one of the best, fanciest law schools, whether the school has a ton of resources and sends a ton of clerks or not, the advice really too often is still accept the first clerkship you are offered, go for the fanciest clerkship. Never say no to a judge, never quit a clerkship even if you're mistreated, and never say anything bad about the judge you clerk for even if they're abusive. So what I'll tell students is you will very likely get several clerkship offers. You should do the clerkship that is going to be the most beneficial to your career And to answer that question, you should say, who is going to treat me well? Where am I going to have a good work experience? Not what is the most prestigious credential. Now with LAP, there's a lot more information. We run a clerkship review platform where clerks review their bosses, students pay to access the platform. And that's really broadened out the information that's available to these students to make an informed and empowered decision. I think this past year was the most competitive cycle, and this one's going to be even more competitive. And this really increases the urgency on every student who is applying to subscribe to LAP's Clerkships database, to be an informed decision maker, to actually do your research and not just rely on what your law school tells you. It is even more urgent this year, even when LAP cannot be on every law school campus and we're doing fewer events this year, we're on fewer campuses. This information is available to you.
Yeah, I mean, and I think this is a hard topic, right? In the sense that law students do need to be their own advocates in this process, both in how they find jobs after law school and how they look at clerkships, and then thinking about the law school's role in the clerkship process, faculty's role in the clerkship process. And so as I've mentored students, I've always encouraged them to do as much research as possible and qualitatively get underneath some of the perceptions and assumptions and promises that might be communicated to them. And so as you're talking to students qualitatively, what kind of questions do you suggest that they ask as they're looking at their opportunities?
Well, some of the ones we've already talked about. What do you want to do after your clerkship? What kind of law do you want to practice? Where do you want to live? Importantly, what do you want to get out of the experience? Is it a credential, writing and research experience, a reference, a lifelong mentor, recognizing that's the exception and not the rule? There are definitely, I work at my nonprofit with some judges on our advisory board of directors who are certainly lifelong mentors and awesome, and people know that about them. But it's, what are your goals for clerking? And then I think the next step is, what do you want the experience to be like day to day? Do you want it to be social? The word you've used before is monastic, or kind of like secluded. What do you want your day to day to be like? I think it's important to think about what kind of responsibilities you have outside of your clerkship, a spouse, kids, family responsibilities, because some of these clerkships, the euphemism some people use is it's not a lifestyle clerkship. And what they mean is you're in chambers basically 24/7. Those are some of the questions I would have people consider, but I really want to encourage everybody to understand that nobody should endure mistreatment. Nobody should endure outrageous hours. If you cannot get your work done from 8 a.m. to 6 p.m., there may be an issue with the management of the chambers and the judge, and you should think about why the judge wants you to be there at 9 p.m. or on a Sunday. I really encourage people to think about how they can be empowered and informed decision makers and really take agency over their careers. That's something you mentioned earlier, too. I want to see more students take agency over their lives. And despite the success of the nonprofit and the Clerkships database, I worry that too many students are not doing that. They're just kind of still applying indiscriminately and then using LAP's database as a resource once they've gotten an interview, once they've gotten a job offer. Then you're in a really negative bird in the hand situation where your one clerkship offer, oh crap, the judge has reviewed really negatively. Should I accept the job anyway? And they usually do, and that leads to bad situations. These are hard questions to think through because I think most law students, you hear about the judiciary. It's this really like pristine and revered place where nothing bad ever happens, or very little bad stuff you hear ever happening. And it's hard for people to think that maybe these very powerful, successful people are not always good bosses. And I think that shatters a lot of people's images of the legal profession. But it's important to think about that now when you're a 2L and not when you're 6 months into an abusive clerkship, trying to figure out how you're going to get yourself out of it.
Yeah, and this is a core question at the heart of the profession. And we've had Heidi Brown come and talk about emotional resilience, right, and thriving in the law. I think it's a perpetual conversation about how can we be lawyers and helpers and healers and problem solvers while we don't face some of the friction and tension in our own profession about how we mentor and train and work together, right? And there is a little bit of, I guess, assumed suffering, if I can say that, right? Where it's like, this is just, it has to be hard, and this is part of the process, and you have to suffer on the front end to get where you're going to get. And I don't know if I fully agree with that. I think we can have a kind profession that works hard and is committed to excellence. But to your point, asking questions about the operations of the chambers and how the judge treats folks. And is the judge assigning work, or is the judge assigning sort of tasks that might belong in the home versus in the workspace? And how do you think about that? And everyone has to make that decision for themselves, right? Is that a price of entry that you're interested in accepting? And I would push students to prioritize themselves in the experience and wanting to have good, healthy boundaries around that experience and not give away their agency in that decision. And it's harder when that might be your only option. But I also don't want students to lose sight of making a really proactive, thoughtful decision for their own success and the kind of learning that they want to have. LAP is an amazing database. You're speaking to thousands of former clerks and students as they're making that decision. Are there other resources? I know law schools will have more formal surveys sometimes. They'll have advisors. Might be an informal network of former clerks that you can lean on depending on what groups that you might be a part of in law school. Are there other resources out there that you would recommend?
Yeah, and I would say LAP's Clerkships database, we've basically been operating the platform for about 2 years, and it's a repository of post-clerkship surveys. So about 1,500 clerks have submitted about 2,000 surveys. We have about 1,200 judges reviewed, primarily federal, but we're trying to get more state surveys. And basically it's just a review platform where clerks can share their experiences anonymously if they want, empowering them to submit candidly. Students pay $50 to access the platform, and they can apply broadly. And I say all that because it is loosely based off what you mentioned, which is law schools' internal databases. I think 7 of the top 14 law schools have those internal databases. And when I launched a nonprofit and I started talking with clerkship directors and career services deans about the resources they use, that was kind of the gold standard. Unfortunately, and what I would caution people as you're looking through your law school's database, those surveys are uniformly positive. I think one school's database has about 600 surveys, and I think there were 10 negative ones. And that is not representative of people's actual lived experiences during these clerkships. I think some of those databases are really useless. Some are more helpful, but I would encourage people to interrogate those resources, maybe dig deeper and don't stop there. Most of the databases for the law schools, you put your name on them, so you can then reach out to the clerk. Many law schools also have a directory or a historical list of everybody who clerked and who they clerked for. We definitely encourage students to reach out. I think that is most useful during the interview stage or between interview and accepting a clerkship, just because that's a very time-intensive process of doing that outreach, and on the clerk's end or former clerk's end, scheduling those 20 or 30-minute chats. That's a good way to elucidate candid information. But since we've been talking about the right questions to ask, you as an empowered student need to know that the right questions to ask are like, did you enjoy your clerkship? You could be as pointed as, was it abusive? Were you mistreated? If you have those concerns. What did you do? What did you like? Would you recommend this clerkship? Like, you have to be pointed about the questions. And I say that because a lot of mistreated clerks I speak with are very fearful, even years later, of sharing negative information with students. They don't really know, where is this going to go beyond my conversation. And some of them will tell me, I have said my clerkship was great when it wasn't, to a student who reached out. And while I felt conflicted, I also felt fearful of retaliation. So you just really need to be thoughtful about the resources your law school is providing you. Again, because we talked about those misaligned incentives, it's not that the law school wants people to have bad experiences, because they don't. But they do want a lot of students to clerk, and they want to announce a lot of prestigious federal clerkships. It's not all law schools have a historical list. You can always go on LinkedIn and try to figure out who people clerked for. You can always look on people's law firm bios and try to figure out who they clerked for. These are very time-intensive practices, and what LAP tries to do is really centralize the information, make it very accessible, affordable to students, and so it's kind of like a one-stop shop. There are definitely other resources. Again, just think about the incentive structure behind why these resources are provided to you.
Yeah, and I mean you do mention that it does take time. I keep reminding students that in order to be your own advocate, you really do need to do that diligence. And so you're going to learn how to do diligence for your clients and how to put your clients first. And in this process, you need to put yourself first. And so if you're looking at firms and employers and clerkship employers, it behooves you to do the work and use your critical thinking skills in the different answers you're getting to really get underneath what kind of experience you want to have. I understand it's a lot of time investment, and I understand that law students are very busy in their academic and extracurricular commitments, but you are the one who gets to determine what your future experience could look like. And so you should do that legwork to be able to have a more positive experience.
I'm glad you mentioned the time because I was literally just emailing with a student today about this. And they basically said, I don't think 2Ls need to be thinking about clerkships right now. It's late October. You can start thinking about it in the spring. And I really push back on that. Lapse database, the subscription cycle aligns with the law school calendar. So you get a year of access if you subscribe in August. You get fewer months access for your $50 if you subscribe in the spring. That is because we want students to do their research over the course of the year, not frantically in spring, 6 weeks before you're submitting 100 applications indiscriminately on Oscar. It really is a time commitment, and you should be thinking now. It's so important to be intentional as a law student about your career so you have options, so you are planning ahead. The clerkship process is really a year process. Like fall of 2L, you should be thinking, who are my professor references? What does my resume look like? Where do I want to apply, and start doing that research? I mean, you should really be thinking about that as a 1L and like intentionally connecting with professors who you want to be job resources and references for you. But this is an intensive process. Clerkships are prestigious, and there are reasons for that. People have worked really hard to get them. And don't think you're just going to show up in June, apply for a bunch of clerkships and just get one. You're not. And if you do, you're probably not getting the ideal one. You may be getting the bad one that the 2,000 people who use Lapse database to avoid that bad judge, they avoided them, and you're stuck with that one. So
yeah, and you just got ahead of my question. What's the process, right? Like, let's walk through what the process is, what documents you need, how you should think about the timeline. Is there variance depending on the kind of clerkship about what you should be preparing and what the process looks like?
Definitely. So the process, if you want to clerk right out of law school, is probably going to be your 2L year. So 2L fall law schools are hosting clerkship programming and getting you thinking about cover letter, resume, writing samples, 3 professor references. Some schools really, really centralize that process in their clerkships and career services office, such that like your 3 references, you have to go through the clerkships office if you're going to apply. Some schools only advise 2Ls really to dissuade 1Ls from starting early. I think it's important to mention that there is a clerkship hiring plan that some but not all judges and circuits subscribe to. And basically it was a DEI initiative when it was initiated about a decade ago, I would say. And that really was because historically judges would hire 1Ls, very new law students with very little experience, basically on your 1L fall grades. And who does really well 1L fall? Well, the well-connected, those whose family members are lawyers, are judges, who struggles, who needs time to figure out law school, first-gen folks, historically marginalized groups. So the plan says, judges, you can only interview and hire students 2L summer, June, after 4 semesters of grades, to kind of equalize the process a little bit. Now, because it's the federal judiciary and they don't follow any rules, judges can subscribe or not subscribe to the plan. So there are some circuits where all the judges are on plan, some that are off, some judges who hire on plan and some judges who don't. And it's on students to know that. Now, it is historically, though not exclusively, more conservative judges who do off-plan hiring. That really means if you're a 1L and you are conservative, you're going to need to go through kind of FedSoc, Federalist Society, or some other resource to get the information if your law school is not advising 1Ls. So let's say you're a 2L, you're applying on plan. Fall, you're thinking about your documents, cover letter, writing samples from previous internships. You should be doing your research, I would say, in the fall. We have a lot of students diligently looking in the database now. I really think coming back, though, winter break and coming back in January is when students are thinking in earnest about where they want to apply, subscribing to the database, looking at their school's resources, starting to get their materials together. Spring, that really hits a fever pitch, and right after finals, you're going to apply in June if you're on plan. Mid-June, you'll submit all your application materials on Oscar. That's the online clerkship application and review system. It's an online portal. Judges have to review, if they're on plan, all those applications over a 48 or 72-hour window in June, which is insane. And then they'll start extending interview offers the following week. They'll extend offers soon after that. So it's an elongated process on the front end, and then an insanely condensed process when you actually apply and interview. And, if this is kind of freaking you out, if you're hearing this and you're nervous, that's why you should start early. Subscribe to Labs Database now, do your research now, talk to your clerkship advisor now, and start browsing your school's resources now. If you want to clerk, be intentional about it so you're setting yourself up for success. Those are for people who want to clerk straight out of law school. For federal judges, most state judges, I think state Supreme Courts too, will do the process either aligning with on-plan hiring, so 2L summer, or the following fall. I got my clerkship September of 3L fall in the DC courts. So many judges will hire into 3L fall. There are plenty of students who will apply 3L, take a year to practice, and then go clerk. And so they'll be applying through 3L year. And there are, of course, people who will take a couple years of work experience before they clerk. There are an increasing number of judges, especially federal judges, who want students to have work experience. That either means they won't hire them until they've been a couple years at a firm or doing something else, or they will hire you several years out, 2027, 2028, and expect you go do a fellowship or go to a firm and then come back to us. So it is unfortunate that the process is not more centralized. I think the goal of things like Oscar, this online application system, was to centralize the process a little. But really, a judge's chambers is their little fiefdom. They are the boss. They decide when they hire their 2 or 4 district or appellate clerks. And you just have to roll with it. And that's why it's so important that law school career services offices, clerkship advisors are providing you with information and resources. Here's how you apply for a state clerkship. Here's how you apply for a federal clerkship, your timelines, things to be thinking about. It really is a lot, and I wish it were less, kind of how it looks right now.
Yeah, that's super helpful. I'd also plug David Latt does a newsletter where he talks about trends, especially for SCOTUS clerkships, and how we're seeing a few more folks who are coming in later on after law school to do later stage clerkships. So another good person to follow. Well, I have one last question that I wrap up all of our conversations with, which is, what advice would you have for your law school self right now?
Oh, that's interesting. Gosh, I clerked because I wanted the credential. I wish, and I don't know how I would have known this, I wish I'd known a little bit more that not all clerkships are positive. I applied for clerkships in 2017 and 2018. That was around the time that notorious harasser Alex Kaczynski had resigned amid a series of misconduct allegations. He turned out to be a notorious harasser spanning decades. I was not in those fancy T5 law school circles, fancy appellate clerkship circles. I wasn't really aware of that. But I wish I'd thought more about what are the implications if this clerkship goes awry, considering this is a powerful judge, it's a small hierarchical work environment. What would the implications be for my career? And I remember even when I was clerking and I was being mistreated, I was like, thank God this is only a year and then I can get away from this. And I didn't realize that this was going to have ripple effects over the course of my career. So I wish I'd thought longer and harder about what would happen if this job experience goes awry. I mean, there are more resources now. There's more information now for students to make that decision. But I wish I'd thought more about that. I might not have clerked. I certainly would have clerked somewhere different.
Yeah, I really appreciate all of the work that you've done. This is such a hard topic, and we've seen schools struggle to be able to have a conversation around it transparently. So I'm grateful that you've started this conversation and kept it going over the last few years. I think it really underscores the importance for law students to be their own advocates, to be really intentional about why they're choosing what they're choosing in their future careers and deciding whether some of these more prestigious objectives are for them, or at least how to make the trade-off decisions about what they want to do. So we are really grateful to you and your work and your transparent perspective on this.
Thank you.
Thanks for listening to How to Navigate Law School, the podcast dedicated to guiding you through the hidden rules and practical skills essential for success in law school. For additional resources, visit PLI's Law School Hub at pli.edu/law school. Please note that the views and opinions expressed during this podcast represent those of the individuals being interviewed and not necessarily those of PLI. PLI is a nonprofit learning organization dedicated to keeping attorneys and other professionals at the forefront of knowledge and expertise.